Usually we're around 20, but I think the actual readers of all our books, because we read one book a week, I think the actual readers are around 12.
Okay.
Hi everyone. Today we're with Professor Proctor, who is the editor for the Literary Review, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And she's also one of the first people to organize a creative writing course in Italy, if I'm not mistaken. And well, first of all, thank you so much for coming. And I think I'm going to start with a very difficult question.
Okay.
So there's this phrase that Freud says quite often in his books, which is one isn't mature before one forgives his or her parents. So I thought that would be, I could start with the question, have you made peace with your projection or your image of your mother, or what you perceived as your mother? Like what you remember of your mother, perhaps is a better way of putting it.
I can answer that question. I made peace with both of my parents many years before I wrote this book. My mother and I had a very complicated relationship that then we worked hard on and we resolved. So by the time I was in my by the time I was in my 30s, I think that we had a pretty straightforward, good relationship. We worked out a lot of the things that were more difficult from adolescence. And my father, who doesn't feature very large in this book, I'll just add, it's because I wrote another book before this one about him, and a lot of what I needed to work out with him. It was a very different kind of book. He's a very different person than my mother was. So a lot of what I needed to work out or resolve with him, I did in that first book. And when I published that first book, my mother did say, "When are you writing a book about me?" And it only took 15 years or so for me to answer that question. But yeah, so I had forgiven and made peace with her and who she was long before I embarked on writing this book. Yeah.
What do you think helped you? I'm not sure if I could say fix your relationship, but something really important for everyone is that one's relationship with one's parents is very difficult. No one can say it's easy. So I was just wondering, what do you think were some of the steps that helped you mend this relationship?
Quite very, very frankly, my mother was one of the reasons my mother had a difficult time during my adolescence. It just coincided with my adolescence, which was difficult because everyone's adolescence is difficult. But so we had a bit of a perfect storm. But she was depressed. And so one of the things that she did was to start seeing someone, and she had some medication. I think I talk in the book about she was one of the first Prozac patients. And I remember her coming up and saying, oh, Minna, there's a miracle pill. and it kind of pulled her out of a bit of an abyss and made her more receptive to me and to talking. And by more receptive to me, I mean less vulnerable. She was very, very fragile. And so we didn't fight because she was so breakable. And then when she started feeling better, I felt like she was stronger, and we started to have more difficult conversations and kind of worked through them during my college years, to be honest. I lived with her during my college years, and in the house, just the two of us. And that was kind of a great period for rebuilding and for hashing things out. We kept talking about it, though, as the story says in the book. I was in my 30s. I was in my 30s when we talked about the high school graduation event. So things kept coming up. It's it was a rich life with many sources of conflict. So
that was really, yeah, that was a very touching part of the book, because I mean, all of us blame our parents for something, and we never really think about that other perspective. Like she says she was hidden and she didn't want to embarrass you, I think. That was
yeah,
the,
yeah.
and yeah, that was really touching. And
Really,
well, I was just wondering what started, like, what made you start the book, and what was your reviewing process? It's a rather technical question, because at least 4 of us are trying to write our own books, and
trying to
we
write
thought
books.
your experience could help us.
So, well, especially for those of you who are working on your own books, after I wrote that first book about my father, I did not like publishing. It was actually quite a traumatic experience for me. And I loved working on the book. I love working on books. And then publishing is a little more difficult. That project in particular was difficult. And I sort of stopped. I went into a kind of hiatus of writing, and had a lot of kind of carried around a lot of insecurity about whether I could write. And what happened was that there's an essay in the center of the book called Master of Her Destiny, Author of Her Destiny. Is that, no, I'm sorry, excuse me. The one that's called A Mystic at Heart. So the essay that's called A Mystic at Heart ended up being commissioned by a literary magazine that doesn't exist anymore, called Guilt and Pleasure. And they commissioned the essay from me. And at the time that I wrote it, I thought I was going to write this really funny, or darkly funny, essay about how none of the Jews showed up after my mother died, and how that's the thing Jews are supposed to do, is they're supposed to bring you food, they're supposed to show up, and they all kind of abandoned me. And I thought it was going to be very funny, and I ended up working with this wonderful editor, and we worked through the piece a lot. And it's pretty similar. It's been revised, but it's pretty similar to what actually appears in the book. That was the first building block of the whole book. It's when I started thinking about a voice for writing these pieces. But it was very gradually then, and if insecurity interests you, which it does most writers, then what happened is I began being asked to write a couple of other pieces that were actually introductions to ebooks. They were ebook versions. And so the piece in here about Monica Sarcini, for example, which is called Lapus, was an introduction to a book that, it was an introduction, it was sort of a literary introduction to a book about Susan Sontag by Sigrid Nunez. And the Distress Abandon, which is about getting a test for cancer, was an introduction to Ferrante's Days of Abandon. So there were these ebook versions. I was commissioned to write these sort of specialized literary pieces. I did them in a personal way because that's what they were interested in. And being asked to do those pieces brought my courage back. And so after that, I began kind of thinking about pieces and creating them really at a rate of about every 6 months. Each essay was about 6 months from soup to nuts. And I was thinking of it as an essay collection, but then at a certain point, it really started gaining its body. I started understanding it and building it, and then it was a book. That once, for a writer, in terms of process, I feel that once the book starts kind of moving under your feet, a mini landslide, once it starts, you start thinking about it, and you have a thought, and it changes and it grows, then it's actually an organism, and then you're really working on it. And that's what happened with this book. It was many years in the making, and so many years of those was getting my courage about writing back.
Wow. Well, the next question, perhaps it's been partially answered, but one of our members was wondering why you titled the book Landslide. So there's a mini chapter, I'm not sure if I can say a chapter in the book that's titled Landslide, and it talks about an Italian boyfriend. And it also talks about, you almost explicitly say that the book is also about, well, mostly about your relationship with your mother and with your mother. So I was just wondering if you could expand on that idea or the title.
Landslide came, I have a really bad habit, which is to get a song that starts feeling totemic as I'm writing. And so the first book is actually entitled Do You Hear What I Hear, after it's a Christmas carol, Do You Hear What I Hear? The Landslide, I'd gotten hooked at a certain point on the song, the Fleetwood Mac song, Landslide. And I think that when I say I get hooked on a song, there's something about finding the voice. You know, songs have voices. They have they conjure moods. And I think that the lyrics and the sound of that incredibly sad song, Landslide, which is about aging and about relationships changing. It's about sort of, you know, hitting a point in your life where if pieces start to fall, everything crumbles. And so what happened is I had this song in my head because it felt at a very superficial level related to what I was writing, at a tonal level exactly like what I was writing. And then when I thought about it for the title, I realized how I felt like it was the story, you know, this idea of a landslide applied across all of the pieces in the book. So it was sort of this bad habit that just glommed onto the book and described it, I thought, so perfectly. I couldn't imagine, at a certain point, I couldn't imagine a different title. So it came from the Fleetwood Mac song. Yeah.
All right. So there's this question about growing up with so many roots. I'm not sure if I could put it that way.
Yeah.
About because you're I'm not sure if you're half Italian, but you've got so many different roots, so many different, such a diverse background. I was just wondering if you could talk about that, and perhaps you could confront it with a more stable childhood.
Wow. So I have no Italian in me whatsoever. The Italian in our family is all adopted. My mother was in Italy on a Fulbright in the 50s. She fell in love with it. She brought us there. She bought this funny house there in Arezzo, or in Provincia di Arezzo. And somehow I found my first important friends there, my independence there. And I'm terrible with languages. I mean, it's interesting because I'm a translator, and I've built so much of my life around this kind of biculturalism. But it was really hard for me to learn Italian, and I couldn't do it in the classroom. I went to all of the lessons and tried to memorize verbs, conjugations, and really it was my college boyfriend who was Italian, who just sort of kept, you know, rapping me on he said, well, do it like you do in Come si fa liceo. He'd rap me on the head every time I pronounced something wrong. And so So I really learned by kind of being in Italy, by trying to talk to people, by listening to television, by listening to people talk, by looking at newspapers until my eyes bled. None of it made any sense. I feel like Italian newspapers are probably the most challenging thing to read unless you're really adept at politics and rhetoric. But so it was so hard to learn it that once I got it, it really felt like I really felt like something that I had. And so from when my mother brought us when I was in high school and I started pounding away at the language and the culture, it was this thing I had that I'd done, despite my mother. She brought us there, but then I made it my own. And then in terms of the other roots, I grew up in a family that was, half Jewish, half Christian, and what was essentially kind of a non-religious anarchy for a lot of my life. And there were little odd developments. It was really kind of nothing for much of my life. And then my parents got divorced and my mother was interested in Judaism. So I had a bat mitzvah. And so I dipped in and out of Judaism then after that. And then my father, after he got divorced, he went back to his roots and tried to become a priest, and was rejected. And that's the subject of my first book, was his path and really trying to figure out how a person gets rejected from the priesthood. So I got very interested in his religious path. Now I think in terms of religions, I'm incredibly interested in them and the way they form lives and the way they form philosophies and how thought gets shaped through faith and belief, where faith and art intersect. But I never said, I still have that kind of nothing anarchy that I started with. So those are some of the different roots. And then the other ones are more boring. It's like, oh, this parent came from Poland and this one came from Ukraine and this one came from Odessa in Ukraine. This one, there were the Jews from Ukraine and the Cossacks from Ukraine.
But you must be partially Hungarian as well, because Zoltan is a Hungarian name, isn't it?
So the Zalman is Polish. That's the part that's definitely Polish. And I don't know whether it goes back before that into Hungary, but it was Warsaw. It was where that part of the family is from, Warsaw. So, yeah.
So we've got two more questions, and the difficult one.
I want to answer that actually in a less scattered way. I love stories, and I feel like all of these roots give me access to stories and ways of thinking about stories and lenses through which to think about stories. The more, they're just all food for the idea of stories, different stories about how you're made, how life is, how cultures are. So I think that's my actual capsule answer to your question. Yes.
Actually, you do partially talk about it, because you talk about this girlfriend of a friend of yours who you met once and you don't remember what her name was. You say, oh, Alma or Rosa, I think. I'm not sure. And you say that your friend commented on the different personality you had with different languages. And so you do kind of touch this subject. The last, well, not the last one, the penultimate question is a rather difficult question. First, I'd like to quote part of your book. So I think towards the center of your book, you say, you quote your ex-husband, I'm guessing ex-husband, who says, if we ever get divorced, we'll just have to get back together, and et cetera, et cetera. And well, most of us are pretty young. We're from 20 to 25. And I was just wondering if you could talk about love in a certain sense, or your experience with love, and how do you think what role it plays in someone's life?
Ooh, what role it plays. I will say that I think that that was probably, I felt like that was the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. It sort of sits there in my life. And one of the things about romance is, one of the things that makes things romantic is that they have a kind of aching quality. It's so fragile and it's so breakable. And so that kind of aching and that longing is part of love, and you put the two together and you kind of get romance, I think. And so that's how that line is central, because I think a lot of the book is about longing, but it's not simple longing. It's about how the longing and that ache kind of converts from the relative simplicity of a love affair between, between two people who are in love and thinking about marriage or thinking about being together, like setting up shop together. There's a kind of simplicity to it, especially since in the early stages, you're all that exists for each. You exist in a kind of wonderful cocoon, and that's the joy of it. And then as things go on, it splinters and becomes, and I don't mean splinters as in breaks, but so many other things become part of it. That cocoon gets more porous. What I think about love and falling in love and that romantic love is that it's kind of related to the last question that I answered. I think very much that falling in love is about getting bigger inside. It's about opening your heart and letting your heart be bigger because it's a little more open. But it's also about opening. It's about growing your brain. When you bring someone into your intimacy, you kind of absorb or want to absorb as much of them as you can. The things they tell you about their lives, the things they know, their perspective on things that you talk about that are different than your perspective. And so in a way, that period of falling in love is this period of incredible brain growth. And it's like early childhood language acquisition. It's like you are a big sponge and you're just taking this other person in. And I feel like the urge to love the urge to fall in love is this urge to be bigger, to have other people make you bigger in your brain, make you smarter in a way, make you know more things, but not things like, kingdom, phylum, genus, species, nothing like that, but bigger, like as if you too had been to that country store, as if you too somehow knew what that candy bar tasted like. And I think that is this kind of rapid fire, incredible experience. And it doesn't have aching in it. It doesn't have longing in it. It's just growth. And it's good for us. Love is good for you. And then, because you asked about age, you bring more and more people into your lives, and you find that growth. You find more places for that growth to come to you. You're better at as you get older, you get better at finding it in other people, in your friends. I mean, some people are incredibly talented at making friends and drawing them into your intimacy. But just take an average person who's not especially good at it, like me. You find people, and you find their stories, and they begin to feed that same kind of growth in you. And that's when love spreads from being that kind of person-centric thing to being more of the fabric of your life. And I think that that kind of openness to other people and eagerness to grow just through, so you get it from your friends. I get it from my students. I get it from books I read. You know, I get it from my children, who I love already, but they give me a bigger life inside. And so transposed in those different, from those different angles, I think that that's some of what I think about love. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. We did a how could I say, a non-formal poll among some of our members, and none of us ever had or heard such a romantic phrase.
Yeah.
And well, as my last question, I think I'm going to ask you, let's see where it was. I think I'm going to ask you, what do you think three pieces of advice, or what would be three pieces of advice you'd give to younger people who are thinking of writing or are thinking of writing? That's it.
Okay. So the first easiest piece of advice is to read, which it sounds like you guys are doing. You're reading a book a week, which is better than most people I know in the world. I'm in a book club. We read a book every 2 months. I mean, we read more books, but that's our schedule. I think reading is absolutely the most important thing. And I think reading things that you really enjoy. I don't really believe this idea that there are things you read that are good for you, that will make you a better writer. I think that, especially if you're thinking about writing, anytime a book bores you or angers you or you struggle to face it, you just put it aside. There are so many books. And so I think that you should read things that you love. And the more things you love, the better. And then related, when you write, you should be writing something you would love to read. And then also related, but more technical, I think, is that I have lots of, I teach creative writing. And so I have a lot of advice that I give at different times, depending on the circumstances. But I do find, since this book is a memoir, and if people are thinking about how to approach memoir, I think one of the things to think about that's related to reading what you like and writing what you'd like to read is that there's nothing that is mandatory to include in a memoir. And so if you are boring yourself when you're writing your memoir, then I would just stop, just sort of shut that page down and move on to something you're more interested in pursuing. Even the most kind of linear, narrative of a person's life doesn't really have, you don't have to put where you were born. You don't have to put your first memory, unless it's a good one. You put the things that are really interesting you. And if you're like, oh, I've got to tell this story, and you feel that way about it, then maybe wonder why you think you have to tell it and what would happen if you didn't tell it, and maybe just skip it and say, oh, I'll come back to it. And then you might find you don't really need to come back to it. It's writing a memoir is really an investigation into yourself. And it's in many circumstances, it's retelling stories that you've told or that you think you're made up of. You think we're all made up of these stories that happen to us in our lives. You can't write a memoir putting together those stories that you've told forever. you know, those are your kind of highlight reel. This, you know, when you go on a first date and you're like, here are the important things you need to know, or even further back when you were in summer camp and you were like, okay, new best friend, here's the details. This is what you need to know. This is my relationship with my mother. This was my first boyfriend. This is where my father lives. And this is how often he calls. You need all that stuff. When you come to writing a memoir, you've got to see all those stories as if you've never told them before. You have to re-see them. And there are tricks to doing that, but none of it is obligatory. It's anything goes, and it's really, you follow what's interesting, and that's how you kind of keep going through the hard spots of writing. Are those good 3 pieces of advice?
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to ask 2 mini questions, well, pseudo questions. So the first thing is, I was rather surprised by the fact that you didn't mention putting a daily goal to writing, because often, well, in the last 3 books we read about writing, many authors say you have to fix a daily goal and try to do that every day, like, I don't know, 2 pages or etc. etc.
I think that the best daily goal advice I ever got, the most sort of practical, and the one that I follow, is to work on your project for half an hour, which is a really small amount of time. But the point of that exercise is that everyone, no matter how busy your life is, and I guarantee you, I have an incredibly busy life. I have 7,000 jobs and a family, you know, and I live in New York. Everybody has half an hour. You can always find half an hour, and you go into your project and you write a line, you rewrite a paragraph. It's like you spend half an hour a day visiting with your book. It keeps you in the zone, so that on the days when you have more time, or the muse is hot, you know, on those days you're there, you're ready to go. But the half an hour visit with your book every day, what's so nice about it, it's like a diet that you can actually do. Everyone has half an hour. You visit with your book, you keep it in the forefront of your mind, you keep the machinery going. You never feel like, oh, I've betrayed it. So I think that was terrific advice. And I got that from really a professional writer who writes young adult books and writes, you know, a book a year minimum, if not more. So someone who ferociously writes every day, but she was like, half an hour, you can't fail. And feeling as if you failed your project is so self-sabotaging. So I think that half an hour is the best advice that I ever got. That's machinery. It's like, what's the trick that works for you? That's different than that's different than process. It certainly is. So that's why it's not my top tip, because I think of that as sort of the nuts and bolts kind of stuff. Do you have another nuts and bolts question? Is that what your second question is?
My second question is if you could suggest the next book for us, our next book.
Oh my goodness.
Just to give you some context, normally we read books on foreign affairs, politics, or economy. But any suggestion would be fine. Or perhaps something you're reading right now.
I'll tell you that I have a couple suggestions for nonfiction. Hold on, let me get the other one. 1 second. All right. I'll tell you, I have been reading Hamnet, the novel. I've been reading a lot of novels because I'm working on fiction. So if you are feeling if you're feeling fictional, Hamnet is phenomenal. It's so phenomenal. And I've been reading a lot of new fiction. I think Hamnet is spectacular. So I would recommend that. I don't read foreign policy books. I'm sort of a literary person. A book that has similarities to mine, if you liked mine, is this book by Sejal Shah. This is One Way to Dance. This is a collection of essays, too, of personal essays. And she gets into, there's a sort of cultural politics. She's Indian American. And so she talks about growing up Indian in Rochester, New York. And I think it's very interesting. And when she talks about race, it's delicate. She's also got a visit to Italy in there. And then another book for people who don't read poetry, but are interested in complicated political and cultural ideas. I really would recommend Layli Long Soldier's book, Whereas, which they're poems, but they're very readable for those who, especially if you don't read poetry. And she's Native American, so her poems about American history and the history of Native Americans, I just think they're so beautiful. And there's one poem, 48, which I actually teach. I teach a class in critical thinking and global culture, and to very young students, but sophomores. But this poem 48, if you read it, you might get a sense of whether you'd like the whole book, or actually you could spend a week talking about that poem. Actually, so those are my recommendations. There's no foreign policy at all. I'm so grateful that you all read my book, because I'm not foreign policy either. So I'm really happy that you found it.
Well, normally we choose our books with some criteria, but every few months we vote on different books. So that's how we found your book.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
And, take care.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thank you. Okay.
Ciao.
Bye-bye. Ciao.